A gunshot echoed through Houston. That sound brought to light terrible secrets that had been hidden for years. The man who died was a killer, the killer of young men whose number remains unknown. This death would shed light on unsolved cases and uncover mass graves that no one knew about. Why did the death of Dean Arnold Corll, the killer nicknamed Candyman, come at the hands of his own partner? Dean Arnold Corll was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His family life was turbulent. His father was strict and disciplinarian, while his mother was overly protective. At a young age, he suffered from rheumatic fever and was diagnosed with a heart murmur, which led to exemptions from some school classes. He grew up as a quiet, introverted, and observant child, but that silence hid a dark shadow. His family moved frequently. He grew up in Memphis and later in Texas. His mother remarried and Dean gained a stepbrother. The family started a small candy business. This venture shaped both his social circle and his future peculiar habits. Even as a child, he was different. No one could have guessed that behind his silence lay a horror that would deeply shake Houston years later. In 1964, Dean Corll was drafted into the Army. He completed basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana, and was then assigned as a radio technician at Fort Benning, Georgia. He was quiet, disciplined, and meticulous. He learned everything, revealing nothing. Military life strengthened his sense of order and patience, but also deepened his repressed desires. During his service at Fort Hood, Texas, he first discovered his hidden side. But Dean did not enjoy the Army. He felt trapped beneath the uniform. His desire for freedom and to create his own world grew alongside his inner darkness. On June 11, 1965, he was honorably discharged, with no one aware of the storm raging inside him. He returned to Houston and rejoined his family's candy business. Among small sweets wrapped in colorful paper, he began building a new identity. Dean became the smiling young man known throughout the neighborhood. He handed out candy to the street children, making them laugh. People began calling him Candyman. But this nickname was merely an illusion. Behind the innocence lurked a dangerous shadow. That shadow planned carefully, gained trust, and slowly set the pieces of a dark game that would soon terrorize Houston. The smile of that silent candy-distributing man was, in truth, the harbinger of the approaching storm. How many murders were hidden beneath that smile? Dean Corll's horrifying path began on September 25, 1970, with Jeffrey Allen Conan. The 18-year-old was a first-year college student who disappeared while hitchhiking to his family's home in Houston. Corll offered him friendly help to take him home. However, this offer became a deadly trap for the young man. Conan was manually strangled, with a cloth stuffed in his mouth. His body was found at High Island Beach, beneath a large rock covered in lime, with hands and feet bound. After his first victim, Corll's accomplice, David Owen Brooks, witnessed Corll's acts of cruelty and physical abuse. In exchange for his silence, he was promised rewards. Corll offered Brooks $200 for each victim, which triggered the next cycle of brutality. Brooks and Corll's next victims were 14-year-old James Glass and Danny Yates. Both were lured from a religious rally in Houston Heights to Corll's apartment. Tied to a 4-poster bed, the youths were subjected to severe mistreatment and strangled. Their bodies were buried in Corll's rented boat club cabin. Alongside Yates's body, electrical cables were also buried. The events did not stop there. On January 30, 1971, brothers Donald and Jerry Waldrop were kidnapped by Corll and Brooks while walking to their parents' home. After being tortured in Corll's apartment, both were buried in the boat club cabin. Between March and May of 1971, Corll killed 3 more victims: 15-year-old Randall Harvey, 13-year-old David Hilligiest, and 16-year-old Gregory Malley Winkle. All were abducted in Houston Heights and buried in the rear section of the boat club cabin. In October 1971, Corll and Brooks met Elmer Wayne Henley, a young runaway from Hamilton Junior High School. At first, Henley rejected Corll's offers, but over time, he was drawn into Corll's dark world and gradually became his accomplice. Henley began actively participating in the abductions and murders of the young men Corll targeted. In several cases, he tied up the victims, witnessed their suffering, and helped with the preparations for their deaths. On March 24, 1972, Henley lured 18-year-old Frank Aguirre into Corll's van and brought him to Corll's home. According to Henley, Aguirre was unaware of Corll's true intentions. However, once inside, Corll attacked him, restrained him, and carried out a vicious act of violence that ended his life. Like the others, Aguirre was brutally tortured and strangled before being buried at High Island Beach. Henley's involvement grew with each crime. On April 20th, 17-year-old Mark Scott was kidnapped by Corll and Brooks and murdered after enduring horrific abuse. In Corll's apartment on Schuler Street, other victims were also killed. Their identities remain uncertain to this day. What Henley witnessed during that time changed him forever, transforming him from a silent observer into a cold, willing accomplice.
In the summer of 1972, Dean Corll moved out of his Schuler Street residence and, at his new address in Westcott Towers, murdered 2 more victims. The first was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, who vanished on the night of July 19th after leaving a party near Heights. Corll strangled him and buried his body in the boat shed. During the torture, he struck the boy's chest repeatedly with a blunt object, horrifying evidence of Corll's growing brutality. About a month later, 19-year-old Roy Bunton was abducted while walking to his job at a shoe store in Northwest Mall. Corll gagged him with a towel and duct tape, shot him twice in the head, and buried him in the shed. Neither Brooks nor Henley revealed that the young men were Corll's victims. Bunton and Sickman's identities would not be confirmed until many years later. On October 3, 1972, Henley and Brooks encountered Wally J. Simoneau and Richard Hembry walking in Heights. Both were lured into Brooks's Corvette and taken to Corll's apartment in Westcott Towers. That evening, Simoneau's mother was on the phone with her son when, moments before the line went dead, she heard him say the word "Mom." It was the last thing she ever heard from him. The next morning, Henley accidentally shot Hembry, and Corll finished the job, strangling both boys. Their bodies were buried in the shared grave inside the boat shed, alongside James Glass and Danny Yates. In November 1972, 18-year-old Willard Branch disappeared while hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston. His gagged and mutilated body was buried in the shed. On November 11th, Richard Kepner vanished on his way to a phone booth and was later found strangled at High Island Beach. Throughout the year 1972, Corll and his accomplices murdered at least 10 boys, aged between 13 and 19. 5 were buried at High Island Beach. The other 5 were hidden in the boat shed. On January 20th, 1973, Corll moved into a new residence on Wirt Road in Spring Branch, where 2 weeks later he killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, a boy who knew both Corll and Brooks and had visited Corll's apartment before disappearing. In March 1973, Corll vacated the Wirt Road apartment and, after a short stay on South Post Oak Road, moved into his father's house in Pasadena. This transition caused a brief pause in the killings. Between February 3rd and June 4th, no known victims were recorded. But by June, Corll's murderous urges had returned stronger than ever. Henley and Brooks witnessed a terrifying escalation in brutality, and Henley would later describe it as a thirst for blood. On June 4th, Corll and Henley abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. After 3 days of torture, the boy was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Less than 2 weeks later, 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn suffered the same fate. On July 6th, 15-year-old Homer Luis Garcia bled to death in Corll's home before being buried. 5 days later, on July 12th, John Sellers was shot to death and buried at High Island Beach. In July 1973, after Brooks got married, Henley became Corll's sole provider of victims. Between July 19th and July 25th, 3 boys were abducted and murdered. 15-year-old Michael Balch, who was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn, and Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones, who were buried in the boat shed. On August 3, 1973,
Corll kidnapped his final victim, 13-year-old James Stanton Dramala. The boy was tortured, assaulted, and finally strangled inside the Lamar Drive home before being buried in the shed. Brooks described Dramala as a small blonde kid who had ordered a pizza and stayed in the house for about 45 minutes before the attack.
On the evening of August 7th, Henley invited 20-year-old Timothy Cordell Curley to a party at Corll's house in Pasadena. Curley accepted the offer. Brooks wasn't there at the time. Henley and Curley went to the house, sniffed paint fumes, and drank alcohol until midnight before stepping out for a short while. On their way back, Henley ran into 15-year-old Rhonda Louise Williams, who had fled her home after an episode of domestic violence. The three of them returned together to Corll's house. Corll became furious when he realized Henley had brought a girl. Remaining outwardly calm, he offered them beer and marijuana, but soon, those substances rendered the youths unconscious. When Henley woke up, he was confronted with a horrifying sight. Corll had handcuffed and gagged his victims. Curley and Williams were tied up beside him, completely helpless. Corll threatened Henley, declaring he was going to attack them both. "I'm going to kill you all, but first, I'm going to have my fun." Henley stayed calm and managed to reason with him. After about 30 minutes of tense conversation, Corll untied Henley and moved the others into separate rooms. But Henley was watching closely, waiting for the right moment. Still dazed from the inhalants, he suddenly grabbed Corll's gun and shouted, "That's enough, Dean!" As Corll advanced toward him, Henley stepped back and fired multiple times. The bullets struck Corll in the head, shoulder, and lung until he collapsed in the hallway, bleeding to death. Later, Henley described his emotions as a storm of fear and shock, mixed with a twisted sense of pride that he had reacted quickly and decisively, just as Corll had taught him. Corll's body was found at the Lamar Drive residence. Henley freed Curley and Williams from the torture board, and the three debated what to do next. Henley suggested that Williams run away, but she instead chose to call the police. Using Corll's phone directory, they contacted the Pasadena Police Department, finally bringing years of horror to an end. After Dean Corll was killed, all that remained were shattered families and horrific memories. Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks told police about their roles in the murders that had spanned years. Brooks and Henley had helped Dean choose his victims, set the traps, and hide the bodies. David Brooks was convicted on March 4, 1975, for the murder of William Lawrence and sentenced to life in prison. Wayne Henley, in his first trial, was found guilty of 6 murders and received 6 consecutive 99-year sentences. Even though he appealed and requested a retrial, his conviction was upheld. Henley is serving his life sentence at the Mark Stiles Unit in Jefferson County, Texas. Since July of 1980, all of his parole requests have been denied, and his next hearing is scheduled for October of 2025. Brooks served his life sentence at the Terrell Unit near Rocheron, Texas. On May 28, 2020, at the age of 65, he died in a Galveston hospital due to complications from COVID-19 and was buried at the Captain Joe Bird Cemetery in Walker County. It is known that Corll and his accomplices murdered at least 29 boys and young men between September of 1970 and August of 1973. However, the real number of victims is believed to be much higher. Because Corll was killed before his crimes were fully exposed, the true number he claimed will never be known. Of the identified victims, 27 were confirmed, while the 28th, whose body was never found, was identified as Mark Scott. All of them were either shot, strangled, or killed through a combination of both. This dark story exposes the most terrifying sides of human nature and the horror that some criminals are capable of creating.